So let's talk about evolution for a moment. Evolution, natural selection, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is evolution is real. Um, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So first, the diversity of life on Earth, that's a reality, right? We can see that. And so, what we see, the diversity of life, and the things that everything has in common. Remember, we talked all semester long. We talked about all the things everything had in common. We talked about DNA. We talked about nucleic acids. We talked about proteins. We talked about the genetic code. All of those things that we have in common. Mechanisms, how things work. Mechanisms, how things breathe, how they reproduce. Life has that in common. Um, Evolution explains both the similarity and the differences. And it's beautiful. And the process is absolutely marvelous. It's an exercise in logic. Um, I don't I know there's going to be some resistance to this. But look at it as an exercise in logic. Nobody is asking you to choose between understanding and conceptualizing this process and choosing to believe in God. What evolution is an explanation of the creation. So God is bigger than that. He we didn't know it. The Bible isn't literal. We didn't know it back then. They explained it as best as they could. There's still room for God. So just put that on out there and let's talk about evolution. So, one of the first ideas, one of the first people who brought forth, or that we know about, that brought forth this idea of um, natural selection was Darwin. And what Darwin saw on an island, he saw that there were different populations of finches. This was on Galapagos. And he said, well, it's not very likely that finches came to this island at different times. So chances are what happened is finches came to this island once. And from this one finch that came over, there was a change that happened. And now we have four different ones that look very different from each other. Um, and so that was the first idea of natural selection. And it turns out that it was absolutely right. So what you see is, and what you have to keep in mind is you have to keep in mind that there's always competition. There's always competition for food. There's always competition for nesting spaces. There's always competition in life. So imagine the finches. There's one finch that shows up at the Galapagos Islands, and it's got this kind of beak over here in the middle. Um, so this middle kind of beak. And all the finches look exactly the same, and they're all competing for exactly the same kind of seeds. And everybody, has the same chances at survival. And then one day, there's a finch that is born that has a smaller beak. It can suddenly reach little nooks and crevices in trees that nobody else can reach. The small beak was a complete accident. It just happened. But it turned out nobody else was eating the bugs yet. And so that little guy with its small little, he had an advantage. He had an advantage and went, not on purpose, right? But probably couldn't eat the big seeds and found the little grubs in the trees and went, all right, that works for me. And so as long as there are niches, there is a place for somebody to fill the niche. So, maybe there were bigger seeds that neither this one nor this one could eat. And those bigger seeds just remained uneaten until one day a finch was born that had a bigger seed, a bigger, a bigger beak. And maybe prior to that, lizards ate those seeds, and now this big beaked creature now is going to, I don't know, compete with the lizards. Who knows? But this is basically how this happens: is you always have competition, and then somebody beats the other person, beats the other organism out in the competition. So Darwin and Wallace, they wrote about this about the same time. Um, there was a and we this is ongoing. This is not a process that stops. So the book talks about the fact that there was a major drought in 1977 that reduced the number of small beaks that reduced the number of small seeds available to the finches. And so you had a major population of small beak finches die, which meant that over time, the average beak size of these organisms increased because those were the ones that were successful, right? That's what selection is the one that makes it in the competition lives, the one that doesn't make it in the competition dies. Um, Everything comes from a common ancestor. There are certain structures that we see that come from the very beginning. There's certain structures in plants that all plants have in common. Uh, Body plans that we have as humans, and you look at skeletons, how similar they are between different organisms. All of those things, those are the similarities these we have um, between each other. Now, one of the very famous examples of natural selection is the idea of the peppered moth. So what happened with the peppered moth is that the peppered moth exists in England, and there are two color variations of this little guy. There is a white version of it, and there is a dark version of it. Um, and what happened is they used to live on birch trees, which are white. They have a white kind of bark. And so the original population was mostly white, and very few dark individuals. But then with the Industrial Revolution, what happened is that the trees darkened, because there was soot all over. The buildings were dark, the trees were dark, the roads were dark, everything was dark. And so the white moss stood out like a sore thumb, and birds were picking out the white moss right and left. And so, because there was a selective pressure against the white moss, all of a sudden the dark moss became much more prevalent. And that's what this shows. So that this is time. And at some point in time, the white moth was much more prevalent, and then its numbers went down as the environment darkened, and the dark moths came up and became way more prevalent. Now, what's happening these days actually is about thereabouts or so. There was environmental protection things that came to place. And so these moths now, as the environment is getting cleaner, the numbers are going back to the original numbers of the original population of white moths, where they're actually more prevalent than the other ones. Um, One of them is not better than the other, right? It's better in the environment, right? There's nothing better without the environment. Um, Now, there are different things that can. Normally, you would expect these things to just kind of come and go and drift in and out, but sometimes these equilibria, they don't. If you don't have big enough populations, then problems can happen. And so, one of the things that can happen is called a genetic drift. So, in the case of genetic drift, If, for example, there's something about, the homozygous rabbits that makes them more prevalent to reproduce, if these are the only two that reproduce, all of a sudden all of the offspring is just going to have that genetic material. That's sometimes a problem. Sometimes that's called, like, if there's a catastrophe that happens to an organism where you have very very few left of the organism, then that can reduce the genetic variability of the population. And if you have very little genetic variability, you can. It's difficult for you to resist yet another catastrophe. And so, one of the populations that we know of that had, at very least, one bottleneck in their population at some point is the cheetah. The cheetah populations are very endangered. And part of the reason why they're so endangered is because the male sperm is in abysmal shape, just looks horrible, which is probably due to the fact that there was at some point a reduced, a very small bottleneck population. And they have never been able to recover from that because they just don't have enough variety of organisms there in order to be able to, refresh that genetic material. Um, Gene flow happens when one organism travels from one geographic location to another. So here, for example, there would be these would be they would be considered two species initially because they're geographically separated. But if this guy moves over here just naturally, um, it could then introduce the brown allele into this green population. We're going to see this as global warming is happening. We're going to see this more and more as species are moving in and out of regions that they're, currently at home at. So imagine the polar bears, which still can, they can still reproduce with grizzly bears. So at this point, more and more polar bears are moving away from the ice floats because the ice floats don't exist anymore. So they're moving more onto land, where they're going to encounter the grizzly bears. They're going to start fighting with each other, but they're also going to start mating with each other. So we're going to get more and more of these hybrid animals. And there's going to be genetic flow and new species that are going to happen as this is happening. Um, we know how some species changed over time. The horse is one of those really interesting things. Um, and again, right, remember that the one that survived, that's the survivor, right? There may be lots of branches that had dead ends somewhere where something changed. Maybe it's some of them, one of them walked on two legs and it just wasn't a successful adaptation. Um, but so the ones that made it all the way through, those are the ones that survived, that were successful. Um, and in this particular case, some of the things we think had something to do with their survival. There was at some point, must have happened, a change in the teeth. Um, 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 Horses' teeth are very flat. They're grinding teeth, so they're made to eat grasses. So they probably adapted around the same time as the prairies adapted, which is the grasses themselves have very interesting characteristics. They can survive even when they're being eaten from the top, because a lot of times the shoots are on the top, right? So if you eat the top of them, they don't survive. Grasses are different. You can eat grass from the top because they're coming from the bottom. So all of these things work together, right? Once horses were on the prairie, it probably was advantageous to be fast. So little taller, little faster to be able to get away from predators. That whatever happened, whatever happened was the thing that worked out for it to survive. Um, so this idea of the common ancestor is also illustrated by the fact that when we look at the bones, when we look at skeletons, we can see that there's an anatomy that is identical between different organisms. So, looking at, for example, the human arm, that arrangement of bones is exactly the same as the dog's leg. It's the same bones. They may look a little different, but it's the same bones. Same's true for a bird. Same's true for a whale. All of those things, we have a common ancestor. It's the same building plan that's just modified. One of my favorite sayings is that nature is a tinkerer, not an engineer. So it's just the same building plan that just gets tweaked a little bit. Um, Adaptations to the environment, there's certain things that work in one environment over another. So there is an overabundance of white animals in the Arctic. Wonder why that's the case. Well, it's probably because everybody who wasn't white died, right? The white ones were the ones that survived, because if you're competing between something that's a little darker and it's something that's a little lighter, whoever is better camouflaged, that's the one that lives. Um, Now, this also this evidence of evolution is also included in when we look at the plate tectonics. When we look at how so at some point, and this is pretty obvious when you're looking at the map, right? I mean, who hasn't looked at a globe and gone, well, now this corner right here and this corner right here, they sort of look like they go together, right? I mean, didn't you think that the first time you looked at that? And then when you looked at it over here, you were like, well, and if you squeeze this together a little bit more, this will fit too. And lo and behold, yes, it does. So when we look at plants and animals that came about prior to the separation of these continents, you can find the same plants and animals at the edges there. Um, and then, of course, you have the complete opposite thing that's happening in Australia, right? That separated relatively early, before the mammals actually made their way all over the earth, and so the marsupials were kind of protected in Australia. It's all part of natural selection and evolution. It's that competition, right? And whatever keeps you from having to face the competition, right? I mean, if you have your own continent for yourself, you're only competing with those on the continent with you, or the visitors that come in, right? Um, then if we're going to say everything comes from an ancestor, then you can go back to and say, all right, if these four things have this one thing in common, they probably have an ancestor together. And then if you say, all right, then one of them has, one of them started with a big ear, so one of them started with a little ear. So this was his idea of how elephants, the relationship between elephants. We don't guess like that anymore. We now use DNA. So we literally, the sequence of DNA tells us the instructions, right? Um, but when you think back to the genetic code, remember the third codon always could wobble a little bit. So it can be changed, and so what you can do is you can look at literally the genetic the changes in the DNA that happened, whether they had an effect or not. You can look at the changes and you can say, well, if there are very little changes between this organism and that organism, then they're obviously very closely related to each other. If there are big changes between this organism and that one, probably not. So that's, these days we look DNA, and there are literally proteins that exist all the way from a bacterium to us. And we can look at those proteins, how they've changed or how they haven't changed, all the way up to from the bacterium all the way to the human. So when scientists start talking about these kinds of things, they're not making this stuff up. They literally, we have the sequences. I used to be a molecular biologist. I can tell you I worked with those sequences. Um, so then sometimes things get separated out because the climates change or something changes, right? I mean, like in Australia, like something moves away, and so then we talk about these things having separate, being separate species. Um, and they may be able to still mate with each other if they are brought back together, or they may not. They may have changed enough that they can't mate with each other anymore. Um, so then the other kind of and a lot of these terms are really just descriptive. It's the same kind of concept, right? But instead of having like a linear kind of, where it's like, oh, you come from here and you get to this animal, but you say, oh, there were a bunch of different things that this developed into. This adaptive radiation is a very descriptive kind of way to describe that kind of thing. Um, Sometimes you see this a lot with this is oftentimes deadly for animals, but this works really often in a lot of times works well for plants. If you have a diploid parent, a lot of very showy plants are actually polyploid. The parents got together, but they didn't come separated apart anymore. um, and so this oftentimes works well in plants, makes them very showy. A lot of our decorative plants have that. Doesn't work too well with animals most of the time. Um, but when you have two species that have different numbers of chromosomes, one of the reasons why they oftentimes don't result in fertile offspring um, is because their gametes don't match with each other. So sometimes you need multiple matings in order to get actual viable offspring to happen. Um, so there's other kinds of speciation, and like I said, those kinds of things. I am less interested in those kinds of things as I am in the processes that actually lead to these kinds of differences. Um, in this particular case, you have a sympatric speciation that is happening that eventually may lead to a species, but it may not. Right? They may end up to mixing with each other again. We'll see over time. Um, and that's all I had about that chapter. Um, my main take home for um, evolution is the thing I want you to keep in mind is that evolution is not directed, right? Evolution led to all of this. It led to all of this because there were niches available that could be filled. There was competition in it all starts with limited resources and competition for those resources, be that the space, be that the food, be that the sunlight, be that whatever. So if you have three trees that are all the same size and they're competing for the sunlight, the one that manages to grow a little bigger gets more sunlight. And so he leaves the others behind. And so they need to be a little bigger, right? The giraffe didn't grow its legs in order to reach the higher trees. No. In a population of giraffes, there were some giraffes that were a little taller. And those giraffes that were a little taller, they didn't have to compete as much with all the other creatures, including the other giraffes, but all the other creatures, too, antelopes, you name it, that were eating the same height leaves as the other giraffes were. And so over time, the giraffes that were taller, they were the ones who didn't have to compete so much. So they were able to get more food. They were able to spend more time, making babies. And so they were successful. Now, the next question is, why do giraffes not grow anymore? What keeps them from growing anymore? Are there limitations to these changes? Clearly, the changes aren't on purpose, so some things can't take time to happen, right? But yeah, so these are the kinds of things I want you to think about.